Hi, Stella.
Hi, Sasha. I've been told by our producer we should say our names, and I've been actually avoiding saying your name for the last few weeks. I have a secret, so
Oh
I'll tell you
no.
why. Well, I realised with a shock and a horror that I'm kind of mispronouncing it because I say
What do you mean?
Sasha. Well, I just realised everybody American says Sasha as if it's an O. So Lisa says
Oh,
hi, Sasha. Everybody says Sasha, and I say
yeah.
Sasha. Hiya, Sasha. And I just
Well,
realised I'm mispronouncing her name because I remember it was a few weeks ago you said your name and I went, oh, is that how you say it? It's Sasha, not Sasha.
that's
So yeah,
so
I've been
interesting.
avoiding it. So this is my little confession.
Hey, podcast co-host. How are you? Well,
Yeah.
I will reassure you that actually you can pronounce my name that way. And as a matter of fact, I'm thinking my father pronounces my name Sasha.
Aha.
And my
Good.
mom pronounces it more like Sasha. And then some people say Sasha with like an O-ish sound. So I
Oh,
think it's
yeah.
fine. And if we have, well, first of all, I mean, most listeners will now know I am not Russian, but my name is Russian.
That's right.
So if we have any Russian or Eastern European listeners who can correct us, I believe the pronunciation in that part of the world is Sasha.
My way.
Sasha.
Sasha.
Sasha. I think so.
Yeah.
Sasha.
It's so interesting
So,
because it came from I often would be talking with, Carrie Mendoza, and I call her Carrie. And my husband
yeah.
was calling her Carrie. And I was laughing at him. I said, that's like calling somebody Gary. Gary, not Gary. It's Carrie, Henry. And I was completely full of myself, Carrie. And then Carrie said, well, it's Carrie. And I was like, oh. So I was like, Carrie and Sasha. I've been calling them Carrie and Sasha. Anyway, that's
I
been
love
my
how
little.
I love how it sounds coming out of your beautiful
It's
accent. So
it's
I'm fine
obviously
with it.
a stronger accent than I certainly thought. Anyway, how's your life been, Sasha?
My life has been well. It's been good. And yeah, I really don't have too much to report. I mean, what I would have reported was a piece of news that came out towards the end of our podcast with Leor about my deep dive into the Memory Hole
Oh
podcast
yeah.
and repressed memories and the unbelievable number of parallels with what is going on today. So when we talk to Leor, we end up discussing that. And then that kind of also shifts into our Substack listener community kind of exclusive content. So it was a great conversation, and that's been on my mind a lot. What about you? You have some updates and stuff going on in your
Yeah,
world.
I listened to that podcast too. I really recommend it to people. Really, really interesting. Sad though. It's a sad, very
Yeah.
good reflection of how, especially girls, can get caught up in a contagion, and they can feel so serious, looking for meaning and purpose, often looking for a reason for distress. That it's
Yeah.
so easy to get caught up in. So yeah, highly recommended. Looking forward to your videos and. I think there's so much going on, it makes me dizzy, but we are at the moment collecting any submissions for Detrans Awareness Day. So if any detransitioners or anybody who's been harmed by medical transition, Detrans Awareness Day, it's very interesting. It's only about 3 years old and it's on the 12th of March. And, we've each year we've kind of let out different bits of material just to kind of raise awareness for detransitioners and people who've been harmed by
Where do
medical
people
transition.
go? How do
So
they
they can, if
submit their
they emailed
stories?
info@genspec.org, we take it from there. But any sort of submission, we pay a fee for anybody who wants to submit something, and it gets published on Detrans Awareness Day. And we really try and help people. They don't have to do it with their name attached. They could just send an essay in, or they could do a
Anonymous.
piece of audio. There's lots of different ways
Okay.
you could submit a piece. Anything to raise awareness for it. We
Yeah,
already have a couple of kind of anyway, things planned, so it's
that's
just an
great.
extra. Yeah, I think it's
We'll make
important
sure to
that,
put that in the notes so that people can
yeah,
easily find the links.
and it's a while away from now, but it's important to know that these events are coming. Anything to
Yeah.
raise awareness to what's going down at the
Hmm.
moment. We can do our little bits with retweets and hashtags and stuff like that. But today's conversation is with Leor Sapir. We had him on about 18 months ago, and he was fascinating, and he was fascinating yet again today. Really, really good.
Yeah, so he's a researcher in political science, and he's, the best person really to talk about the way policy and legal changes, stuff that feels very, I guess, like unsexy and behind the scenes, because, we talk about the cultural piece, we talk about the media, and that has a really kind of glittery facade that is easy to see. But Leor's really good at explaining the way behind the scenes policies or like subtle changes in language of a law or a bill or whatever can have these ripple effects. And it's super interesting. And today we talked about a lot of things, including kind of like the relationship, the medical ethics relationship between consumer and doctor and institutions, and the way, especially in gender medicine, every person in that kind of relationship keeps kind of dodging responsibility. And Leor points out that ultimately gender affirming care puts the onus on the patient, even if the patient is only like 9 or 10 years old. It was a really interesting discussion when we touched on that.
Yeah, it was really, really good.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about the bans here in the US, and kind of Leor shared some of his thoughts about the way medicine is regulated. So it was a broad ranging conversation. We hope you will enjoy it. And if you want to go back and listen to Leor's first episode, it was episode 88 in September of 2022, ages ago. So shall I read Leor's bio and then we'll jump in?
Yeah.
Leor Sapir is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. In his work, Dr. Sapir applies his research and academic experience to policy matters, concentrating on issues of gender identity and transgenderism. His inaugural essay in City Journal in the winter of 2022 explores a series of recent court rulings on transgenderism, demonstrating how bad ideas translate from fringe academic theories into law and policy. Previous pieces for City Journal explored the evolving athletic guidelines and media coverage surrounding trans issues. We hope you enjoy our very interesting conversation with Dr. Leor Sapir.
Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi, Stella, and welcome, Leor.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Glad to have you back. So recently, as of recording this conversation, New York Times published a piece by Pamela Paul talking about youth gender medicine and detransitioners. I was interviewed for it. Several other people we know, of course, were as well. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because it feels like a really big deal for the New York Times to publish something with this much kind of clarity about gender medicine. And so you had made a tweet thread about it, kind of highlighting things that you thought Pamela Paul did well, and then also a flaw that you had seen in the piece. So I'm wondering if we could start there. Could you kind of like summarize what you were talking about in that tweet thread?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to say just off the bat is I think it's unfortunate that some of the New York Times best reporting on this issue has come in the opinion section.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems to be a point that, activists who were outraged by the piece have latched onto, that this is an opinion piece and not investigative journalism. I think anybody involved in this piece, from what I've heard, the detransitioners, anybody who was interviewed, had to hand over mounds of documentation and evidence. Pamela Paul really went out of her way to make sure that her claims were defensible, probably anticipating that they would get torn to shreds by activists online. So the piece is actually deeply researched, and I think it belongs, honestly, as an investigative piece in regular reporting for the New York Times. But having it as an opinion piece, I think, also allows the New York Times to broach the topic in a slightly more critical way without really saying that they're broaching the topic.
could we just say, for anybody who hasn't read the New York Times and, you know, people from this side of the pond, what it was about? You know, if you could just say what the piece was about, because it was a game changer.
Right. I mean, the piece was ostensibly about detransitioners, and it profiled, I think, 4 detransitioners. But it used their stories as a way to explore some of the deeper questions and the research and the evidence or lack thereof behind these interventions. And so, you know, uncharacteristic for an opinion piece, Pamela actually does cite some of the research in there. She goes into some of the you know, what we do and don't know with regard to regret, detransition, desistance, things like that. It is a very measured, moderate piece. You know, not perfect, and we can talk about that in a minute, but but much better than almost anything we've seen in the New York Times, including, you know, the Times has had 2 or 3 pieces in the last few years that have also generated outrage among activists that, for example, called attention to the uncertainties and potential harms of puberty blockers. But as is usual with these pieces, they tend to miss the forest for the trees. And they underplay the uncertainties and risks, and they kind of genuflect and say things like, you know, what most medical associations agree, without really giving us the context of what that agreement is based on, without really doing a deep dive into, you know, what evidence are they citing and whether it's credible. They've barely touched on changes abroad, which I think is a real point against the New York Times, is that it's, you know, with a few exceptions, it's by and large ignored the fact that the United States has become, maybe with the exception of Canada, an outlier in this area of medicine. And so, you know, pieces like the one that we saw from Pamela Paul are a welcome addition to the reporting
because
in the New York Times.
she did highlight the difference between the way the European countries are moving, what direction they're moving, and the US. And so for the first time in the New York Times, acknowledged this, which seems to be such an important element to me. So yeah, keep going.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it was the first time per se. I think there was an acknowledgement in a few sentences in a previous article. But I mean, if you understand what's going on in Europe, and you care about evidence-based medicine, the changes in Europe should be a story in their own right, and maybe even several stories in their own right. I mean, that's a huge, huge development in the area of pediatric medicine. And the fact that the Times has only found it appropriate to cover it in a few sentences of the past few years, I think is pretty outrageous. But in any case, here we are. We have this piece by Pamela Paul. And as I said in my thread on X, you know, I think she got many things right and one thing wrong. So let me just kind of go through what I think she got right first. I think, first of all, she did mention, or at least hinted, that, you know, the American medical associations really are out of sync with a growing number of countries in Europe, and they're not really based on reliable evidence. So that, I think it's important to acknowledge that there isn't consensus among medical professionals and health authorities on this issue, and that to the extent that there is, let's call it a kind of a majority opinion, it's gradually shifting away from the approach taken by U.S. medical groups. So that's, you know, that wasn't fully explored, but it was at least hinted at, and that I think is good. Number two, I think it's really important to emphasize that the detransitioners who were featured in this piece were deemed good candidates for transition by clinicians who practice the gender-affirming model. And that's important because gender clinicians who practice that model and activists who defend it are constantly telling us that they have highly reliable ways to distinguish between those who are good candidates and those who are not, those who know that they're trans and those who you know, are passing through a phase. And I think that the very existence of detransitioners suggests that that's not true, or at least that, you know, that they can't reliably distinguish between these two populations. And, you know, Paul noted in a follow-up piece to her piece from Friday that detransition rates, or at least discontinuation rates of hormones, according to one study, might be as high as 30%. Now, I should point out that we don't have a good empirical picture of regret and detransition. In fact, those words themselves are contested. There's different definitions for what regret is, what detransition is. Those are important debates to have, important discussions to have. We don't currently know how many people who got medicalized as adolescents or young adults regret their decision, how many have detransitioned. And I think it's going to take us at least another decade until we have a better picture. I don't think we'll ever know with accuracy the full picture.
Yeah.
But I do think it's reasonable to assume that under the affirming protocol that is really, at work in American clinics, because that protocol openly rejects any gatekeeping, any questioning of a person's self-declared identity, I think rates of regret and detransition are going to be much higher than what activists tell us they are, simply because there's absolutely no gatekeeping. So that was the second point. The third point that Paul made that I think was good, although I think it could have been developed a little bit further, is, she mentioned that rapid onset gender dysphoria is a contested, controversial concept, but that there is evidence for it. And she cited a number of sources, including a recent letter to the editor that I co-wrote with Lisa Littman and Michael Biggs, where we used the U.S. Transgender Survey of 2015, which is a survey that is highly biased against any finding of evidence for ROGD, and that is frequently used by activists, researchers, and clinicians like Jack Turbin to launch their crusade against ROGD. And we used that survey, and we said, even if you look at this survey, which is already biased against ROGD, there's actually quite a lot of evidence for experiences consistent with ROGD in this survey. So I'm glad that Pamela Paul highlighted the existing evidence that we have in favor of this hypothesis. And I would point out that it is still a hypothesis, right? We're still accumulating evidence. But part of the hypothesis is that ROGD exists. And I think that's becoming increasingly harder to deny.
Mm-hmm.
I think number 4, a really good point that came across in the article is that this whole narrative that is now being promoted by defenders of gender-affirming care, especially Democrats, that parents should be the ones to decide, ignores mounting evidence that skeptical parents are frequently bullied by gender clinicians, by activists, by activist organizations, and probably by people in their own social milieu, to agree to these medical interventions on behalf of their kids. The idea that you have kind of in this, ideal clinical scenario in which a doctor sits down and gives kind of a comprehensive assessment of what we know and what we don't know, the risks, the uncertainties, all that kind of stuff, gives that information to the parents, and then kind of takes a step back and lets the parents, consult among them, and then they come back with questions, and it's kind of a collaborative decision-making process. Everything I have seen and heard from the world of gender medicine tells us that is simply not true. From the moment the kid sets foot in a gender clinic, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the parents to agree to medical interventions. Even, Jamie Reed, in her account of what went on in the now closed gender clinic in St. Louis, she said we were regularly bullying parents and sidelining the skeptical parent, which is usually the dad, and putting an enormous amount of pressure on the parents to agree to hormones.
And I want to point out too, you've been talking a little bit about this idea that it should be the parent's decision is also a way that clinicians and professionals can dodge their culpability and responsibility if somebody feels harmed by these interventions. And this is a really important point, because I hear people on both sides of the political aisle use this phrase that well, it's up to the, they often say doctors and parents to kind of collaboratively decide, just as you describe.
Right.
But a lot of people are saying, well, this is up to the parents. And it's kind of ironic. I'm just thinking out loud. we often say, we believe that parents know their kids best. In the vast majority of cases, your parental instinct, blah, blah, blah. But there is this coercion. And sometimes there are parents who actually go into these clinics demanding the hormones and interventions. And I think Hannah Barnes also kind of describes that in her book. So it's very complicated and tricky because everybody's trying to kind of dodge responsibility and put it on somebody else.
That's right.
So,
and of course, ultimately, if you look at what gender clinicians, the influential ones, the ones who advocate in the public, the ones who testify in court, the ones who actually write the guidelines, if you look at what they themselves say, they are actually putting all responsibility on the kid, right? They're saying, like Jason Rafferty in that interview that he gave to Jennifer Block that was published in the Boston Globe, he said, the affirmative model is child-led. It's oriented around a child's sense of reality. Those were his words. And it's all about following the child where the child goes from start to finish, meaning even if the child detransitions and regrets it, helping them through detransition is itself part of gender-affirming care, right? So it's all the responsibility is placed on the kid. That really shows that this model of care is being imported from the world of adult medicine, where it makes more sense. I'm not going to say it makes perfect sense, but it makes more sense to just let adults dictate their own treatment decisions. But they're putting it on kids as young as 10 or 11. That's a totally different story. So then the question is, well, what is the role of parents here? And, I think there's an understandable tendency among critics of gender medicine to want to hold these parents accountable and maybe even demonize them and say, how could you possibly do this to your kid? And look, I'm not denying that there are parents that do this to their kids for reasons that are not, legitimate. For example, meaning that they're not really trying to help their kid; they're trying to help themselves in some way, right? So the kind of the Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And in Hannah Barnes's book, the GIDS clinicians do describe that they've encountered some of these cases. It doesn't seem to be a majority. But they do exist. It's mostly women who do this, but it's pretty rare. And one thing that I've learned about from reading a little bit about Munchausen syndrome by proxy, it's extremely difficult to diagnose.
Yeah.
And so taking all these things together, the fact that it's rare, the fact that it's very difficult to diagnose, the fact that, the entire medical establishment, as reflected by the medical associations, the Democratic Party, kind of left of center legacy media, everybody is signaling to American parents, to parents all around the world, but here to American parents, that these interventions are medically necessary, well evidenced, and life-saving. My position has been and continues to be, we need to lay off the parents. We need to give them the benefit of the doubt. There is going to be a point in time in which I think the evidence of institutional ideological capture is so overwhelming, in which, the New York Times has already reported enough articles about the dangers and the uncertainties behind gender-affirming care for kids. There's going to come a point where, yes, we can and should start holding parents accountable too, because parents have an obligation. They have a moral responsibility to make sure that their kids are not harmed. But I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we've crossed that threshold yet. And I think also for strategic reasons, and this is what I've said publicly and what you referenced just a minute ago, Sasha, for strategic reasons, I think it's wrong of us to focus on the parents. And I think that because gender clinicians and activists and politicians who give them cover, they are the ones who are desperate to make this all about parents and what they decide, because that offloads responsibility from gender clinicians and from the medical associations that empower them. And so I don't want to see that responsibility being shifted in the public debate onto parents. I want to see people focusing attention on the gender clinicians, on what they say, what evidence they cite, and what the medical associations are doing.
In many ways, we've kind of moved. It feels like it's moved from medical care to consumer-driven care, and it feels like back in the day, it was kind of eminence-based medicine, where it was basically the doctors were in a position of expertise, and their experience was held kind of the most important voice in the room. And then it's moved into evidence-based medicine in general has moved into evidence-based medicine, where it's the evidence, the research will back up any treatment. And in a whole lots of different areas, even psychotherapy has been massively influenced by what is now arguably almost patient-based healthcare, or even you could call it experiential healthcare. It's like, you know what I mean? The voice of the patient has become like, they might come to me saying, for example, I want some CBT. I'm an integrative counsellor, so I could, go any which way. But I'm thinking, well, actually, it's my job to figure out what I think should be the treatment in this, you know what I mean? As opposed to they read it up online. Right. It's become this online Dr. Google thing that's happened. But that's the patient, right. But yeah, it's the patient-based medicine is actually, it feels very empowering and it feels very giving lots of authority to the patient, but it's actually a ruse in many ways. It's kind of allowing the patient to feel very powerful, but actually it's giving away all your rights almost. And when the patient is 10 years old, it's moved from being patient-based to being child-led. So it's moved from being child-centered to being child-led. It's moved from patient-based to being child-led. And suddenly it's actually become a debacle. It's a fiasco at this stage. And you then go back to, well, what was the 7 years training for? What is the high salary for? If the doctor in the room can't take responsibility for all the decisions that are being made, well, then it feels like, well, why isn't this just a pharmacy? Do you know what I mean? So right. it's kind of, it's ducking from responsibility in a sleight of hand that pretends to give the patient so much responsibility. I know I haven't asked you a question, but it makes me very angry.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think this distinction between patient-centered and patient-led is crucial. And I think, I'm not an expert in medicine broadly conceived. So, there are other people who are more qualified to comment on that than I am. But I do think we're seeing more examples of this this trend of casting doctors as vendors, and their patients as consumers. I think the opioid epidemic is actually a pretty good example of that, right? The adoption of pain as a fifth vital sign. There were some good reasons to do that, but at the same time, I think that the tendency there was clearly trying to make the subjective experience of the patient factor in a lot more heavily into the treatment decisions, and that paved the way to the deadliest iatrogenic epidemic we've ever seen, ongoing, I should mention. But look, I mean, when it comes to gender medicine, I think it's really remarkable sometimes when you read statements by activists, by gender clinicians, especially when it comes to adults. But you're obviously seeing this kind of seep into pediatric care as well. That just cuts out the doctor. It almost makes the doctor an irrelevant figure in this whole transaction, right? It's all about the patient and what they want and what they believe is going to make them feel better, as if the doctor's only obligation is to write the prescription if the patient wants it. And what I've been arguing, for quite a while is, no, doctors have a separate professional and ethical duty that is independent of the patient's desires, and that in some cases can override the patient's desires. And that is the duty to first do no harm. So doctors are not, glorified shoe salesmen. They are not, just merely highly trained vendors of some consumer good. They are professionals who practice a science, but also an art, and they are under separate moral and professional obligations. And sometimes that obligation requires them to say no to patients. And that introduces a certain element of paternalism into the picture. And so that, I think, Stella, is what you're talking about, that paternalism. But that paternalism is essential to medicine. I think you always want to try to balance, right? You have to balance that paternalism against the autonomy of the patient, for sure. And medicine can become too paternalistic. But I think the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction. I think gender affirming care is a very good example of that.
We want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. The team and members of GenSpect strive to promote high-quality, evidence-based care for gender nonconforming individuals. GenSpect is pleased to offer a non-medicalized approach to gender with their recently published Gender Framework, and they continue to hold conferences around the world. Visit genspect.org to learn more.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more.
Now back to the show. Sometimes I've compared the shifts in gender affirming medicine to what we might expect from plastic surgery or a real kind of aesthetic consumer based medicine. But even since kind of making that point, I've spoken with various surgeons and people within that aesthetic world. And even they say, if a patient comes in clearly with body dysmorphia disorder, I have to turn them away. I'm not allowed to do this augmentation or that procedure on a person who's clearly suffering from some sort of a mental illness. And there are, even within the field of those aesthetically oriented medical practices, there are certain doctors who are known to do whatever the patient wants at any time, irrespective of whether or not this seems good for the patient, whereas other physicians are having to practice based on those ethical standards. So even in the most kind of consumer-driven versions of medicine, there are safeguards which the doctor's responsible for keeping in place. So there's just like so much here.
Right, that's a good point. I don't have anything to add to that. I mean, I just think it's, again, we just have to constantly keep in mind that there's this permanent tension that we have to understand between the kind of the paternalistic impulse and the autonomy respecting impulse in medicine. And both are important, but the pendulum can swing too far in each direction. I think with gender medicine, it's swung way too far in the direction of autonomy. And it's not even I think a sound, reasonable definition of autonomy. I think actually Roberto D'Angelo had a really good letter to the editor about this question of patient autonomy recently, where he says, precisely if you care so much about the autonomy of patients, exploratory therapy is absolutely essential, because only with exploratory therapy can you help patients understand themselves better. That's the role of a therapist, right? To just take what a patient says and their desires at face value, especially when they're so clearly suffering from various forms of distress, is not respect for patient autonomy. That's just, kind of unbridled consumerism.
Yeah, well, in many ways, therapy is a good example of, you say paternal, I suppose it is paternal. We all kind of eke around the word paternal, but it is quite paternal, but maybe authoritative, or certainly it has expertise involved, right. And the expertise could be respected. I do think that we need to have a public awareness campaign around this, so that the public are aware that there's a decision-making process happening. And, people, I think, might rely too much on evidence-based, and it's all about the research, and somebody else might rely too much on the doctor says, whatever the doctor says. And other people would be completely, I want it, and therefore, and it's actually a triad. It's the three, it's a collaboration between the three is how we should arguably be coming to a decision, with perhaps the most, in my view, the most responsibility as well as authority with the actual doctor who is trained and is kind of has the moral responsibility not to do any harm. Do you see limitations in the evidence-based approach?
Well, so Maybe
What
before we
would
get
be
into that,
the-
let's just finish let's just finish the Pamela Paul section, because I do think we should get into that, because that's a big question.
Okay.
If that's okay with you.
That's fine with me.
Okay. So just, I think one last point that Pamela Paul, I'm very, very thankful that she got right. And that is that, there are problems in terms of how the Democratic Party and left of center journalism has covered this topic. The way, her quote from the piece is, the doctrinal rigidity of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is disappointing, frustrating, and counterproductive. One senses, more than a hint of understatement here. And it's true, the Democrats for I think both ideological and political reasons are deeply invested in gender affirming care and deeply averse to recognizing any of its problems. Although we're starting to see change there. We now have about 24 Democrats in state legislatures who have either voted in favor of age restriction laws or who have voted against sanctuary state laws for hormones. And 24 Democrats is not nothing. That's not nearly enough, but it's not nothing. And I think this represents a growing trend. And I think by the end of 2024, we'll see a lot more Democrats who are willing to publicly express doubts. But it's true that left of center media, with some exceptions, Reuters, for example, but with some exceptions, left of center media have for a long time ignored the plight of detransitioners, and maybe more importantly, what the experiences of detransitioners can tell us about the realities of gender medicine, whether pediatric or adult. So here's what I think Pamela Paul gets wrong, and I think it's a pretty major point to get wrong. I've tried to call attention to what I've labeled the golden mean fallacy in left of center reporting on gender medicine. I mean, there have been a few journalists who have done a really good job, journalists on the left, liberal journalists, who have done a really good job kind of trying to report on the research, on the practices on the ground without, kind of getting dragged into the culture war aspects of this issue. But oftentimes, even in those articles, you get a sense that there's this, that they're trying to stake out a middle position between, on the one hand, the Republicans or conservatives who want to just ban it all. Yeah. Pediatrics, at least, ban it all. And the Democrats and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party who want absolutely no restrictions and, if anything, to scale it up. And so these kind of, journalists who are liberal will say something like, these laws are excessive, they're cruel, they go too far. But at the same time, the Democrats are not willing to acknowledge the risks and uncertainties. And that the preferable approach would be, let's say, the approach being taken in Scandinavia right now, right, where a small number of cases, mostly adhering to the criteria of the Dutch protocol, are allowed to go through with hormonal interventions. And the golden mean fallacy is a fallacy because it wants the reader to think that the middle position is correct simply because it's the middle position between two extremes. But that's not true, right? Extremes can be, an extreme position can be correct. To give an obvious example, most people know that the world is round. Some people believe
How dare you? You're alienating half of our audience right now. Just kidding.
I know.
Keep going.
I know. Some people believe the Earth is flat. Those are two extremes. And in the middle, some people can say, well, the Earth is oval shaped. So that's a good example of why the middle ground is not necessarily true just because it's the middle between two extreme positions. And I think here too, if you look at the evidence, and I think more importantly, if you look at the conceptual framework for pediatric gender medicine, I think it's pretty clear that one of those two extremes is far more correct than the other. Yeah. Because the evidence, even for the supposedly conservative Dutch approach, is severely lacking.
Yeah.
The Dutch study, which is widely cited as the best available evidence, even WPATH considers it to be the best available research that's been done to date. The Dutch study is extremely weak. Methodologically, it has a high risk of bias. It does not furnish high quality evidence in any way, shape, or form. And so we really don't have good evidence even for the most conservative approach to transitioning children. And when you think about the kind of the philosophical framework, the conceptual framework for pediatric transition, it kind of doesn't make sense,
Yeah.
right? And so in light of all of that, I think the sensible position to take right now is that the path of least harm is to delay these decisions until mature adulthood. So I think that's one thing that Pamela gets wrong, and I think that leaving open the door for this claim that, well, certainly at least some kids would benefit from this, even if gender medicine has gone off the rails, even if there's no safeguards, even if the medical establishment is refusing to acknowledge any of the harms. Can't we all just agree that at least some kids would benefit from this, and that all we need really is therapists and endocrinologists who are extremely cautious and only transition the small number of kids who really need it? No.
Yeah.
Even that proposition requires evidence. And the evidence isn't there. And so that I wish that Pamela Paul had called more attention to that, because as long as we leave the door open, it's going to be extremely difficult to bring this, what I regard as a medical scandal, to an end.
That's such a good point. And Stella, you and I were talking about something recently where like a person you encountered who's very, very skeptical of this rush to affirm said something like, but what about the real trans kids?
Right.
So I think you're right that there is this weird, and sometimes I don't know how to assess this. Like, is it that it's better for us to inch our way towards a more reasonable position? Or do we have to be really, really hard line about the lack of evidence for any of it throughout the whole process? Because I'm also aware, having been doing this since 2016, because of the way there's this institutional capture and the mainstream narrative around this is so crazy. Mm-hmm. A lot of people who first encounter our cautious position think that we are conspiratorial and nuts.
Yeah. Right.
So I'm not always sure, like strategically speaking, because I'm just a therapist. Like I work one-on-one with people, about their personal and emotional issues. I don't know strategy on like a big global scale. So I don't know what's best for us to do. And it's an interesting question. And like this kind of makes me think about another topic we'd love to ask you about, which is the kind of state to state bans, because I feel really, again, really confused and torn. Like you're saying, Leor, I can't think of any situation where I think it is appropriate to medically transition a child. I can't think of any scenario where I would think it's advisable. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I know that bans in and of themselves, the way they operate can be so inflammatory as to create like this secret underground demand for something. So do you have thoughts about that? I mean, I imagine you've thought and written a lot about this.
Yeah, I mean, look, let's set aside the issue of kind of the black market, market of hormones, because I think that's an issue. It's a very important question, and there are online platforms like Plume that are now trying to fill that gap, and there are organizations like Planned Parenthood that are also trying to fill that gap. But let's focus on the bans themselves.
Okay.
Look, I mean, we live in a society that is extremely polarized, politically, ideologically. Partisan polarization in particular is very intense. There used to be overlap between the two parties, meaning there used to be Republicans who are more liberal than the most conservative Democrats and vice versa. That is almost non-existent nowadays. The parties are sorted and polarized. Mm-hmm. So if you're conservative, you're in the Republicans. If you're liberal, you're in the Democrats, and that's that. And we're also extremely tribal because of how information is consumed nowadays. if you're liberal, you're going to read the New York Times and Slate and Mother Jones and, Washington Post and whatever. And if you're conservative, you're going to read National Review and Fox News and so on and so forth. And, I'd say it's pretty rare to find, the average American reading across the aisle just to make sure that, that they're not sinking into confirmation bias. I think the vast majority of people consume information from the sources they ideologically agree with. And so when you have laws that regulate an area of medicine as controversial as this one, people are going to want to kind of fit it in to their to the tribal dynamic, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you're a Democrat, if you're liberal, and you see that these laws are supported by Republicans, your natural instinct is to say, well, then I oppose the law, and vice versa. And that's unfortunate, but that's kind of the reality in which we live. And so, look, is it possible that these laws are producing a reaction among liberal Americans, among Democrats, to support gender-affirming care where otherwise they wouldn't? Yeah, of course there is. But I'm not sure there's a better alternative at the moment, because when the medical establishment, this is an argument I keep making, right? When the medical establishment is promoting a harmful practice and refuses to regulate itself or even to allow scientific, open-minded debate on this issue, and we know that kids are getting harmed, what choice do regulators have other than to intervene? And it's not as if lawmakers don't regulate medicine. They do it all the time. American medicine, even though it's correctly recognized as, there's a strong element of free market exchanges, of capitalism, profit motives. These are one of the fundamental characteristics of American medicine in contrast to, let's say, European medicine. But at the same time, American medicine is heavily regulated, especially after Obamacare, especially after 2010. There's almost no aspect of medicine that doesn't have either the direct or indirect imprint of government laws or rules, regulations, lawsuits, all those kinds of things. So to single this out and say, this is a unique example of legislators stepping in and regulating the practice of medicine is obscene. It's just not true. And not to mention the fact that, on the other side of the issue, activists have gotten the Democratic Party to regulate to ban conversion therapy, as they call it. Which in the case of gender identity means, or it has been interpreted to mean even exploratory therapy. So they're also trying to put their thumb on the scale through legislative action.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's crazy the way the different concepts kind of come in and they stay, you know what I mean? Because like affirmative therapy, by calling themselves affirmative therapy, effectively negated the previous 150 years of conventional therapy. And it just with a phrase, by sticking affirmative onto it, it wasn't therapy, and it should never have got past the gate. I suppose I bristle every time I hear exploratory therapy because I'm like, it's conventional therapy. It's 150 years. It's well established therapy, and I feel reduced when it's turned into exploratory. And you're right. I know it's all therapy is exploratory, and I know all that, but it's just an offhand point.
Yeah, and I mean, just to riff off of that just a little bit, if you listen carefully to what mental health professionals who practice the affirmative approach say in terms of what exactly is affirmative therapy, because on the face of it, it doesn't seem like there's a role for therapists at all, right? If all you're doing is agreeing with the patient's self-understanding and self-diagnosis, where do you come in as a therapist? The session is over after 10 minutes. But if you listen to what they say about what they actually do, when they say things like mental health assessment, they don't mean exploratory therapy. What they mean is trying to understand how they can help the already affirmed, clearly self-evidently transgender child cope with being trans in a different domains of life. So in family life, at school, if they have a job, then at work. Wherever it is, that's how they understand their role. So it's kind of like self-help, kind of a new age self-help, right? Instead of therapy being a mirror to help patients become more reflective and ask themselves difficult questions and look a little deeper into their feelings and experiences, the role of the therapist is reduced to kind of a popular self-help guru who just helps the kid, the adolescent who's already figured everything out, figure out how to be his or her authentic self in different areas of life. That's not therapy.
Yeah.
You can call that whatever you want, but that's not therapy, and it's definitely not a mental health assessment.
And
you go ahead.
It kind of takes the form of like a coaching on how to assert this identity, which hasn't been explored, it hasn't been examined, it hasn't been assessed, it hasn't been even thought about. How do you assert this identity in every domain of life? So like these therapists are often kind of helping coach the person on how to demand pronouns from people, how to come out to your parents, how to advocate at the school. So it really becomes kind of an action-oriented kind of like coaching advocacy thing. Yeah.
And one thing that I don't know that I would be curious to find out, because you could see the potential for fueling narcissism here, right? You could see the potential for a therapist kind of inflating the sense of entitlement of his teenage patient. Teenagers are already prone to a sense of entitlement and thinking that the world has to bow down before them, right?
Yeah.
It seems like it would be very easy for a therapist, an affirming therapist, to kind of inflame that sense that, everybody owes me, to understand my pronouns at every single moment, to follow the subtle fluctuations of my gender wherever they go. I would be interested to know, do affirming therapists ever say to their clients, no, you can't expect, if let's say it's a male to female, you can't expect other girls to just accept that you're going to use the locker room. Well, you can't accept other girls at school to accept that, that if you want to run on their track team, that all of them should just be okay with it.
Yeah.
I doubt it. I doubt that they're saying that.
That's a key
but I don't
point.
know.
That's how the phrase has set it up to be anti-therapeutic. Because when you call it affirming therapy, as soon as you say, no, you can't go and play basketball or whatever, what you've just said there, they'd say, you're not affirming. That's not affirmative. So
Exactly.
Immediately you're kind of checkmated. In WPATH, there are standards of care 2012, SOC 7, I suppose, Standards of Care 7. When they released that, they did an extraordinary shift and placed the therapist from the position of a therapist who could offer a therapeutic process to a therapist who's a facilitator, who is offering therapeutic support.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Which is,
and so this is, and that's a really good point, Stella, because this is consistent with kind of the role of, let's say, the prescribing physician, the endocrinologist, as a dispenser of pills, right? So you're no longer that kind of paternalistic element that we were talking about earlier, the gatekeeping function, the ability to say no. If that has gone away at the level of MDs, it's also seems to be going away at the level of mental health therapists and licensed clinical social workers and so on and so forth. So yes, I think it's across the board we're seeing that in this model of care.
Well, I'm even thinking about the way it's gone a step further, at least here in the U.S. I'm thinking about this APA position statement on the care of transgender and gender nonconforming people that I read, and they talked about things like cis heteronormativity and internalized transphobia and the bias of the therapist and the transphobia, and so they're really kind of twisting up the mind of the practitioner in an even more disturbing way. They're not only saying you can't challenge your patient, they're saying if you consider that maybe a male patient shouldn't expect these things, that's your own transphobia talking. This patient is a girl and she deserves to be on the girls' team. So it's like a really twisted way of reframing and reorienting our perception of reality. I mean, I know that sounds so hyperbolic, but it's right there in the position statement. It tells you if you have any kind of qualms about this, examine your own bias as a practitioner.
I mean, it's almost as if the roles are being reversed here. That when a trans-identified kid comes into a therapist's office, it's really the therapist who should be lying on the couch,
Yes.
right? It's really the therapist who's being put through an examination of their own beliefs and experiences in order to bring about a psychological transformation in them.
Yes.
Because of course the trans kid is on a pedestal, right? This is something special. So no, I think you're probably right, and I think that tells you that level of projection among psychologists tells you more about psychologists than about the patients. Right?
Stella, our field's in a bad shape.
I've gone through a very interesting process in the last few years of just really criticizing psychotherapy as an entire concept, and looking at the evidence base and being unimpressed with it, and looking at different kind of strands, looking at the murky history. I was actually at Freud's house in London yesterday. I visited it. And Anna Freud, this is where Anna Freud lived and where Sigmund Freud died, and the actual room that he was in. And you're looking at the wall and you're reading all the crazy crackpot stuff that he came out with. And you're thinking, wow, my industry really, it began on shaky science, and it's continued on. It's a good 150 years later, and it's not doing great, is it? And
well, look, I mean, I don't think
it was all these bad therapists, and now I think the therapists have just moved with the times, and they're told, we're told it's support. Forget about this process business. Now you're a supporter. Go and support.
I mean, look, I wouldn't want to, and I also don't have the knowledge to do this, right? I wouldn't want to just kind of dismiss all of therapy. I mean, maybe you know a lot more about it than I do, but I just personally know a lot of people who have benefited from therapy, and there are therapists, including yourselves, who do wonderful work and really help people. So I'm sure that there has been a lot of improvement and benefits to our society from the advancement of therapeutic techniques. But yes, I mean, you can see that the potential for things going awry in this particular field. Partly because it's not an exact science, and it's just prone to abuse. Partly because
heavily reliant on the therapist, heavily reliant on the clinician.
Right. And partly because it's also just so susceptible to cultural trends. I just got done listening to a six-episode podcast on the recovered memory craze of the 1990s.
We're all about it, Leor. We're talking about it all the time.
I mean, there's a really good book that I'm almost done with right now, called Making Monsters, that really gets deep into the weeds of what happened there, and kind of the origins of the pseudoscientific theories and how they got popularized. And I mean, the parallels to what we're seeing with gender-affirming care are just remarkable. There are entire pages of that book where you could just cross out recovered memory and write gender-affirming care, and the meaning would be exactly correct.
Totally.
As a matter of fact, I am probably, by the time this episode comes out, it will be out, but I'm producing 2 videos about the Memory Hole podcast and the parallels with gender-affirming care and the trans kids concept. And it is incredible. I mean, there are so many things that even though I had studied this, that I keep discovering more and more parallels. And, to go back to what we were talking about regarding therapy, one of the interesting episodes of the Memory Hole podcast, they talked to a couple of researchers and scientists and neuroscientists who study how memory works. And they were talking about how very precarious and subjective it is. And even the way a therapist might ask a patient a question can elicit a cascade of things to where they're trying to remember something that didn't actually happen. And it may not be intentional on the therapist's part, but we're just very vulnerable to suggestibility. All of us are. And when you look at the kind of vulnerability of a child, it's even more apparent that we have a huge responsibility that should be taken seriously, and we should be very sober about how we interact with kids who are distressed, having mental health issues, questioning their identity. So it's so important for people to kind of understand this isn't the first time that therapy has the potential to go off the rails.
That's right. And I, at the risk of preempting some of the stuff that you might say in your podcast.
No, please do.
I mean, there are a number of really interesting parallels here. if I could just mention a couple that really stuck out to me. One is that at the heart of the recovered memory theory is an unfalsifiable theory about how the memory works.
Yeah.
It's unfalsifiable, right?
Yeah.
Because you only know about the memory once it's retrieved. So how could you possibly test whether it exists in a state of repression? So it's unfalsifiable. And in the same way, the idea that all humans have an innate gender identity that's, kind of intuitively known and blah, 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 that's also unfalsifiable.
Yeah.
So that's number one. Number two, I think the mechanism of therapy here, I think, is really, or of diagnosis is really interesting here, right? Because you have a scenario or you have a condition in which certain symptoms are known to be caused by a certain event. In the case of, let's say, sexual trauma, right?
Yeah.
If you were sexually traumatized as a child, that can give rise to certain symptoms of, maladjustment, anxiety, depression, whatever later on. But the move in the recovered memory movement was to go from
Backwards.
symptoms to cause.
Yeah.
And that's where all of the shenanigans came in, right? So if you have anxiety and depression, then we can work backwards and find, and use that as evidence for a repressed memory that can be retrieved through therapeutic sessions where patients were basically subject to the problem of suggestibility.
Yeah.
And in the same way, if you know that that this experience of distress arising from being in a particular sexed body, let's call it gender dysphoria, if you know that causes anxiety and depression, well, then all of a sudden you get these teenagers with anxiety, depression, and you work your way back and you say, oh, well, then maybe they have gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
Right? And then the third thing that I found really interesting as a parallel there was a moment in the podcast, and this also came up, and there's actually a few books that I've read on recovered memory that are really good. But I think this Making Monsters is probably the best. But there was a few passages in some of those books and one moment in the podcast where you had examples of therapists saying explicitly, my job is not to discover the truth of what happened to a patient. My job is to help them feel better. It's therapeutic, right? My job is to help them cope better with their life circumstances.
She actually said, my job is to create a safe space for her to recover her memories.
Or at least to recover, to overcome the sources of distress and so on and so forth, right? So it's like the whether something actually happened becomes unimportant.
Yeah.
Right. And in the same way, I think you can see in the gender affirming field, there's almost a kind of a disregard for, some people actually believe in this theory of innate gender identity. I'm sure a lot of people actually believe in it, but to some extent, I think it kind of doesn't matter. Yeah. Right. Because the premise seems to be, if it makes you feel better to be affirmed, treated as a boy or as a girl, then you are a boy or a girl. Right. Yeah. So it's the therapeutic focus is primary, and whether something is actually true or not is secondary.
I really would recommend that listeners do go and take a break from our podcast, check out the Memory Hole podcast. It's only six episodes, and then you can come back to us. It's phenomenal because she begins, and it shows about the culture of the time, that there was so much talk about incest and so much talk about child sexual abuse. I remember it. They were talking kind of late 80s, 90s. Everybody was talking about it. It was on all the TV shows. It was in all the soaps. It was just in the air, just like gender is today. It's just in the cultural water as such. And she was in her 20s or something like that, and she forgot what she was going to say. This is how the session or the first episode starts. She forgot what she was going to say, and her friends, who were totally into whole recovered memory, said, oh, forgetting what you're going to say is a sign of child sexual abuse that you've forgotten. And she was like, oh, I don't think so. I think I just forgot. I stumbled and I forgot what I was going to say. And they were like, oh no. And then they did this kind of, it's very voodoo. They started doing free writing in their opposite hand. And I just remember, and we're laughing at it because it's 30 years later. But I remember the vibe of it. You'd say something and somebody would say, oh, maybe it's a hidden memory. It was peppered in your speech back then. Right. And, it's a credit to Paul McHugh, who also exposed the work of John Money in the 70s. He's a doctor. He was working in Johns Hopkins. And ultimately, you know, when John Money was gone wild in Johns Hopkins, isn't it called, in the 70s, and he was transitioning people and doing very unethical things. Dr. Paul McHugh got it closed down in 1979, got that gender identity clinic closed down. But he started the False Memory Syndrome Foundation in the 90s. So this guy is a hero. And 4 years after he started the concept, so they were coming in with the recovered memory syndrome. He came in with false memory syndrome. Like, this is a false memory. And 4 years after he started his or he and others, I shouldn't just say him, of course, he got it into the dictionary. So it just shows that the culture of the times, and I feel we're in the middle of this period of transition. Yeah. You know what I mean? That it where it was, it might be your identity, And now people are saying, hang on a second, there's more to this.
Yeah.
So,
well, okay. So that's actually interesting, right? Because I think there are,
Leor, can we maybe take this conversation into our membership?
Oh yeah, let's do that.
Because I really want to hear what you have to say. For now, we want to say to our general audience, we're so grateful to have had you on. We're going to link to your letter to the editor, to your writing at Manhattan Institute, and of course to your Twitter account. Is there anywhere else we can send people to read more of your work?
All of my written work appears on my MI profile, my Manhattan Institute profile. Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
And
well, thank you for joining us again.
Thanks very much, Leor. You're on fire on Twitter these days.
Yeah,
you are
sure.
Knocking it out of the park. Thanks, Leor.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.